Welcome, everyone. If you could grab a seat. My name is Greg Ball, and I'm the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences here at the University of Maryland. And I want to welcome you all to the launch of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poll. This poll comes from two of the leading scholars in the College of Behavioral Social Sciences. The initiative involves the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development, led by who is Shibley Telhami, holds that chair, and the Center for American Politics and Citizenship, both of which are housed in the Department of Government and Politics. The associate director of the poll, Stella Rouse, who has been the director of CAPC for many years now. This represents a wonderful fusion of two efforts that have been ongoing in the college for some time. One that has been looking at foreign policy opinions, both in the United States and in the Middle East, led by Professor Telhami. And the other has been looking at American attitudes toward politics, most notably locally in a joint poll with the Washington Post that CAPC has been running that's received a lot of well-deserved attention for the insights it's brought into the things going on in our state and the surrounding area. I would also like to note that Dr. Frauke Kreuter, the director of the Joint Program and Survey Methodology, and Steve Cole, director of the Program for Public Consultation, will also serve on the advisory committee of the Maryland Critical Issues Poll. Now, at this launch, Dr. Telhami and Dr. Rouse will both present data from the first poll conducted by the Maryland Critical Issues Poll, and I think we'll all agree that this is a time when information is more necessary than ever, given the challenge in understanding the current election climate. After the presentations by Dr. Telhami and Dr. Rouse, they will be joined on stage by Dr. William Galston, the Ezra K. Zilka Chair in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Many of you may know Dr. Galston, who was a faculty member in the School of Public Policy for many years and continues to hold an appointment in that school. So without further ado, I would like to ask Professor Telhami to come to the stage and give his presentation.
Thanks so much, Dean Ball. Thanks so much also for your support of this project. I think the college has been great in working with us to make this happen. The Dean's office, Wayne particularly as well, really appreciate the help, and certainly the Department of Government and Politics and Professor Erwin Morris have worked with us to make this project come together relatively quickly. We did this really very quickly. Also, before I give you the presentation and go through it, I want to say that we're partnering with Nielsen Scarborough for fielding these polls, and they have been terrific in responding to us, and in a very timely fashion, we've been able to field these polls very quickly. In fact, we intend to do another one right after the election. We're getting ready to do that very, very quickly, and they have been able to work with us to implement these very quickly. We're happy to have a representative from Nielsen Scarborough, Jordan Evangelista, who's here. I also would like to certainly thank my colleague, Stella Rouse, who has been a great partner so far in this project, and a lot of people who've worked. I want to single out our colleague, Mike Hanmer, who's been really incredible in helping out throughout. He's given a lot of his time to make this work, and including preparation of questions. And Jared McDonald has worked with us, as well as my assistant, Brittany Kaiser, who's been incredible in just making this come together very quickly. So I wanted to start with that. We're very excited that this is happening. We're also very excited that we're going to involve graduate students in this research, where graduate students will be able to submit questions for some of the polls on competitive basis, as long as it relates to their work, and we're happy that this is getting started. So let me move to tell you about this poll, which is both on American politics and foreign policy issues. Let me start just with a brief word on methodology, and obviously it's all posted on our website. We've created a new website called critical-issues.umd.edu, and we've posted all the data already just now. It was embargoed until 2 p.m., and it's already there, so you can see it, and you can also follow up on the methodology. Those of you who are familiar with Nielsen Scarborough, they have a probabilistic panel of actually the overall panel is really 500,000 and 250,000 people with internet with email addresses. So this is a nationally representative sample of 522 among the probabilistic panel that Nielsen has. Margin of error is 2.5%. So let me start with the foreign policy questions, and then we'll move to the juicy stuff that Stella wants to talk about afterwards. So let me begin with foreign policy, and I want to start with something that is actually more than foreign policy. It's interesting because in some of the polling that I do here in the U.S. and also that I do in the Middle East and elsewhere, I tried to get at the prism through which people look at the world. So it's just that I ask a lot of indirect questions trying to see what is it, what is the prism that people use to look at the world. And one of the questions that I ask is, whom among world leaders, national or world leaders, do you admire most or dislike most? Obviously, this is all going to be depending on who's out there, and these are open-ended questions. So we don't give them anything at all, and we start with it so as not to bias them, later in terms of giving a lot of information, reminding them. So I want to give you a flavor right here because it's telling a little bit about some of the foreign policy questions that come. So remember, this is name a national or world leader. We don't tell them dead or alive either, so it could be anybody. And so here's what we have. Bill Galston, who's going to join us on the panel, one of the most thoughtful analysts in Washington, has been talking every time we meet for the past several years about this increasing divide in our country on all issues, but especially ones related to the Middle East. So it's like two worlds. And so if you look at the Republicans, first is Ronald Reagan. The second is the Prime Minister of Israel, who was, by the way, in first place in the last poll. So he's going back and forth, exchange, depending on how much in the news he is, with Ronald Reagan, which tells you why in the Republican primaries, everybody kept saying, "My friend Bibi Netanyahu," and you haven't heard that since in the general election. But that tells you something. And obviously, on the Democratic side, you have Obama is by far number one, followed by Merkel, Trudeau, and Bernie Sanders. But look at this dislike leaders. So again, if you look at the Republicans, the two top are Obama and Hillary Clinton, above Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin. Okay, so who are basically tied afterwards. And if you look at among Democrats, by far it's Putin, followed by Trump. But it's a remarkable difference, obviously. And keep that in mind, particularly about Putin, because I'm going to specifically address the question of Syria and ISIS, which is something that we polled on in this particular poll. So we started by asking a question about the priorities. We gave them a set of global priorities, so this was not an open-ended question, otherwise it would be impossible to catalog. And we asked them to select two, not one, just so that, because usually one maybe is on their mind, but you also want to push them to get another one. So we have a list of their two top priorities accordingly. And so look at this interesting result. So ISIS by far is number one. 53% say ISIS. This has been also what I found in my previous polls that I did through the Sadat chair, where ISIS has been for the past 2 years the number one priority for the American public. And so it's not a huge surprise. What's interesting is it trumps immigration, which is a big issue. It trumps even trade deficit. It certainly trumps the assertiveness of Russia and the rise of China and certainly Iran too, and Arab-Israeli issue, all these others, particularly ones related to the Middle East. But it's number one. I also want just very briefly talk about their attitudes toward Muslims and Islam, because I've been tracking that. Some of you may have attended our big event a couple of weeks ago on Islamophobia, where I showed that remarkably during our election, American public attitudes have progressively become more favorable of Islam and Muslims since the campaign started. And this is through three polls, November, May, and June, including the one that was conducted right after Orlando. And it was unmistakable, progressive, beyond the margin of error, improvement in public attitudes. I attribute it to the polarization in American politics because Republicans didn't shift. And most of the change came from Democrats and independents in the context of a highly polarized campaign. That's why I could do. So it was very interesting to see whether this has stayed, the trend remains now in October. The last one I did was actually in June, and so wanted to see the trend. And so I want you to look at this. The trend holds still. I mean, look at this track, attitudes toward the Muslim people. Started off in November being 53 favorable, then it went up to 58, then went up to 62, then it went up to 70% favorable. And the unfavorable declined from 46 to 28 progressively, every single poll. And then when you look at attitudes toward the Muslim religion, which have been far more negative than they were toward the Muslim people. The people differentiate between Islam and the Muslim people. And you can see they started off very low, 37% favorable views of the Muslim religion, went up to 42, 44, now it's 49%. That's 12 percentage gain over the year in the middle of a heated campaign in which Islam was said to be targeted, and in fact it was targeted. And obviously what happened is that the passion of minorities had increased, so there's more anti-Islamic sentiment among a minority of Americans, therefore it's consequential, so don't misread that. It's very consequential that you have this hatred coming out of a few, but that's not where the public in general is. That's the good news. The good news is the general trend remains to be progressively more favorable. And in fact, that 49% is the most favorable measurement since 9/11. So we're going back now to the levels of perceptions of Muslims that we've had just right after 9/11. The one that was measured by ABC News a few months after 9/11 was 47% favorable, and it started going down, leveled off around 37%. So it's a pretty interesting and requires a further discussion. But what I really want to focus on before I turn it to Stella is the question of ISIS and Syria. As you know, this is a big issue. The current campaign, presidential campaign, has hardly been about issues, and Americans don't seem to be voting on the basis of issues, but to the extent that issues have been part of this campaign, this has been one of the big ones. This has been certainly because the Americans put such a priority on ISIS. So what's your impression of the current level of U.S. military involvement in Syria? It's at the right level, it's less than I would like to see, it's more than I would like to see. So what you find is that, more people, overall, 42%, look at the black bar is the total national sample. The others obviously are, red is Republican, blue is Democrat, and purple is independent. So if you look at the middle bar, 42%, 42% say that it's less than what I would like to see, but 34% say it's more than what I would like to see, and 22% say it's about the right level. So Americans are divided, but they're more on right level more than I would like to see. And I would say that's more or less where maybe Obama is. If you break it down by Trump supporters and Hillary supporters, you have even a starker division, where 61% of Trump supporters say it's less than what I would like to see. You can see that 36% of Hillary supporters say it's about the right level. What should be the primary objective of U.S. military involvement in Syria? Defeating ISIS and its allies, removing the government of Syria under Bashar Assad, or both equally? Now, this is an important one to look at because obviously this is where the debate is in part. And so what you find is really 52% of Americans and 60% of Republicans say the top priority should be ISIS. And look, Assad, removing Bashar Assad by itself gets nothing practically. So but you do have a third who say both equally. And so it's not that people don't see him as a threat. I mean, when they equate him with ISIS, when you have 1/3 equating with ISIS, that's pretty bad for him. I mean, but on the other hand, it's very clear where the American priorities are. You can see it's, the same trends, across Hillary and Trump supporters. Now, we have a set of questions where we present them with views to see how much they agree or disagree with those views. One we put out there is the U.S. should support Syrian rebels, even if some of our allies, if some of our aid goes to some of the Islamist rebels, as long as the aid doesn't go to ISIS and Al-Qaeda specifically. We need to rely on proxy forces to counter not only the Syrian regime, but external backers like Iran and Hezbollah. And so we asked them to see the extent to which they agree or disagree with this. And I'm just here combining the strongly agree, strongly, or somewhat agree, so just for brevity. But you could see that, 53% disagree with it. Americans are divided, 53 to 42 is, it's still obviously a majority disagree, but again, there is a difference across party lines. Republicans disagree more than Democrats. Republicans worry about the aid going to Islamist groups. The same thing among Hillary and Trump supporters, same divide. So the alternative hypothesis, the U.S. should not support Syrian rebels if they include Islamists, as this could come back to haunt us. There is no way to ensure aid wouldn't reach ISIS and Al-Qaeda, or that the Islamist groups we back won't eventually turn against us. And so here you can see that more people agree with this hypothesis, that this is obviously one of the fears driving public perception, is this is the alternative. They are actually they are more on the side of the presidential Obama's caution of not giving too much aid to rebels, and I think that's very clear in these. The U.S. should not support Syrian rebels. Again, if you break it down by Trump supporters and Clinton supporters, you can see some differences. As you may know, Russia supports the Syrian government, while the United States support the Syrian rebels trying to overthrow this government. But both Russia and the U.S. are opposed to ISIS. What, in your opinion, is the best American path to fighting ISIS? Trying to do it with allies only and avoid full military cooperation with Russia, put aside our differences with Russia on the Syrian regime, and join forces to fight ISIS. And again, here you could see that Americans are leaning more toward putting aside the differences. They're divided, and particularly, if you look at Democrats, they're particularly more divided. But if you look at even the partisan divide here, majority of every group says set aside the differences, and even though the Democrats see Putin as they dislike him more than any other leader in the world. And this is all about prioritizing, obviously. They see the ISIS threat as bigger threat. What, in your opinion, is the best American path to this? Again, this is broken down by supporters of Trump, supporters of Clinton. Overall, how would you describe the degree of Russian-American cooperation over the Syrian conflict so far? It's the right level. It's more than I would like to see. It's less than what I would like to see. Again, look at this number. 67% of the public, 2/3, says it's less than I would like to see. So despite all of the dislike of Putin, they want to see more cooperation on Russia over Syria. And on ISIS, while ISIS is a major threat to American interests that must be confronted, it is not such an existential threat that it warrants huge investment in lives and treasure, and the degree of our commitment must be carefully weighed. This is a hypothesis. So we give them, how much do you agree or disagree with this? Strongly agree, strongly disagree. And you could see here that most people agree with this hypothesis. Small, divided 52 to 46 overall. And there's definitely a big divide, partisan divide on this question. But overall, people agree more than they disagree. A different hypothesis, ISIS is the top threat to American national security and could become an existential threat. We must spare no effort in assuring that it's destroyed. Okay, and here, look at this. Far more people agree with this. Okay, so you've got like almost 3/4 of the public, 83% of Republicans say yes. So we went through all these scenarios where the public, of course, is of two minds, as we, understandably, this is not unusual about issues like this because the public debates itself. They can see the pluses and minuses, they weigh the arguments, and then they have to make a decision at the end. So in the end, a large American ground force to fight ISIS in Syria and Iraq is risky, costly, and unlikely to achieve the desired objectives. There are also always unintended consequences and so forth. We give them this case against the military intervention and see if they agree or disagree with it. Well, 70% agree with it. And then we give them the counter argument, which is a large American ground force is essential to fight ISIS in Syria. And we go through why the crisis causes regional and global instability, generates refugees, and poses moral and security dilemmas, etc. And so we have actually more people disagree than agree. So clearly the public is still more reluctant to send a large ground force. And then we come back with the bottom line. I want to just go through it with it. Now tell me if you support or oppose the deployment of a large American ground force in Syria and Iraq to fight ISIS. Having heard all the arguments for and against, we have a bottom line question: do you support or oppose? And look at this: 63% oppose, 35% support. But it is notable that a slight majority of Republicans, while they're divided, almost equally divided, 51 to 46, a slight majority of Republicans still support a deployment of a large ground force. It's not something that Trump is actually pitching. So it's interesting that the public hasn't moved with him on this, even though they backed him for a nominee. So with that, I'm going to stop and invite my colleague Stella Rouse to do her presentation.
So I want to echo just really quickly the gratitude that I have for the support that we've gotten for this poll. It came together rather quickly, trying to capitalize on the election and rolling this out. And so I again want to thank my colleague Mike Hamner for his assistance, Jared McDonald, great graduate student who helped with this poll, and Brittany Kaiser who really put it all together and made this happen, and of course Shibley for his great work with this, and I've really enjoyed working with him on this. And thank you, Dean Ball, for your support of this effort. I think it's great. So Shibley's presentation was great. He put together a lot of very interesting information about foreign policy, and one of the goals of this poll was really to sort of melt together attitudes and opinions about foreign policy and American policy, because we think they overlap in a lot of circumstances, and a lot of the things that drive American opinion about domestic policy also drive these opinions about foreign policy. And so let me start very quickly just with asking sort of the general horse race question, right? If the elections were held today, which of the following presidential candidates would you be most likely to vote for? And as we see from our poll here, Hillary Clinton has leads 43 to 34% overall over Donald Trump. Now, keep in mind when this poll was taken, and of course, how things quickly have changed in this election cycle. I want to say day to day, but it's almost hour to hour sometimes that these things change. And so what we're capturing as a snapshot may not necessarily be exactly what's going on today, and we can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A, but we certainly see sort of in line with other polls that were taken during this time, and we're taken up to sort of the time of the FBI letter this past weekend, or this past Friday, that Hillary Clinton had, a sizable single-digit lead, and some polls showing into the double-digit, and we see the divide between Republicans and Democrats, which are in line with other polls as well. Just to break it down a little further, gender has been a big issue in this election, and so we've taken a look at some of these questions, breaking it down by gender, and sort of in the general horse race question, we see the difference between men and women in terms of support for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, almost the opposite, right? We see more support among women for Hillary Clinton and more support among men for Donald Trump. And again, the gender gap being a big issue in this election, not only in the horse race, but among other issues as well, which I'll discuss a little bit in more detail. So we also asked, now which of these candidates is the most, which of these is the most important reason for your vote? We've outlined who people have decided they're gonna vote for. So if the election were held today, right, both of these candidates have high unfavorability. We know that. And so it's not the general sort of accepted reasons that you're really rallying behind the candidate, at least for the majority of the populace. And so we wanted to delve a little bit deeper into some of the reasons why people may be voting for their particular candidate, right? So while over a third of both Democrats and Republicans say that their vote is because they agree with their candidates' policy positions, there are other reasons why both Democrats and Republicans are voting for their preferred candidate. We can see that for Republicans, 28% seem to be motivated by the Supreme Court appointment, which has been made a pretty big issue in this election. We've heard a lot of Republican officials talk about the fact that they may not agree with Trump. They may not be enthusiastic about Trump, but the appointments that are going to be made by the next president with respect to the Supreme Court really trump everything else, right, in terms of reservations that they may have for voting for Donald Trump. And an almost an equal amount of people are motivated to vote against Trump, right? We see that 29% say that their vote is against another candidate. We asked it as another candidate, so it may actually be Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. So this speaks to the unfavorability of both candidates in this election and the reasons why people may be actually deciding to vote. So another thing that we delved a little bit deeper into is there are Americans who say they will vote for Donald Trump in the presidential election, even though they're not prepared to say it openly, or who are willing to vote for Trump. This has been something that's talked about in the news a great bit, right? That there's these sort of hidden Trump supporters that when they're asked by pollsters, they're not saying that they're gonna vote for Donald Trump. And many Republicans have said, there are those hidden Trump voters and that the polls aren't capturing the support that Donald Trump may have. And so we wanted to ask a little bit about this. And 87% of respondents, of total respondents, really believe that this is the case, that there are hidden Trump supporters out there, right? With 93% of Republicans, that's a huge number of Republicans saying, yeah, there's a number of people out there who just won't come out and admit that they're supporters of Donald Trump. And even 82% of Democrats say that this is the case. So what about Hillary Clinton? Are there Hillary Clinton's hidden supporters out there who perhaps are not saying that they're going to vote for her when they're asked by pollsters? Well, not as high of a number, right, as there is for Donald Trump. Most Americans don't believe that there are as many hidden Hillary Clinton or closet Hillary Clinton supporters as there are Trump supporters, right? 60% of total respondents, but of course higher for Democrats. 72% of Democrats believe this is the case, but only 45% of Republicans, right, believe that there are hidden Hillary Clinton supporters. And compare that to what they feel about Donald Trump. They really think that the supporters, if they're hiding out there, they are for Donald Trump much more than they are for Hillary Clinton. So another issue that has come up in this election that I think a lot of the polls don't really cover very well or cover in much detail is this idea of change, right? Trump has claimed that he is the change candidate, right? That most of Americans are tired of the status quo, that they're tired of the Washington establishment, and they want something different. In fact, Trump's recent, sort of motto or line at his campaign rallies has been, drain the swamp in Washington, right? I'm going to Washington and I'm going to drain the swamp. So we wanted really to find out how much people really want that swamp drained, and if they want Donald Trump to be the one to be the swamp drainer, right? Because that's not what sort of the questions ask in general when we look at the polls overall. And so our poll shows that indeed a majority of all respondents, almost 8 in 10 respondents really want significant change to the American political system. They are indeed tired of the way the system is currently working, and they want change to take place. And we see that for Republicans, it's 9 in 10, 90% of Republicans have this sentiment. But it's not just Republicans. We see 68% of Democrats and 79% of independents who really feel this way about the state of our political system, which is a little bit discouraging, right, in terms of, where we are with our political system currently. When we break this down by gender a little bit, we see that women are more likely to want change very much. Men are more likely to want change very much compared to women, 82% to 75%. So that's interesting then that men see sort of this, change, motto that's going along being something that they are more attracted to. So we also broke it down not just politically, but also economically. How much do people really want economic change in our political system? And interestingly enough, most Americans want economic change almost as much as they want political change in the system. Okay, we see that for Democrats, this number is about the same. But for Republicans, political change appears to be a bit more important than economic change, looking at this comparing 90% to 74% in these poll numbers, in these survey numbers. The opposite for women here, that women are more likely than men to say they want economic change, which is a bit different than we saw from the political change question. And so it's a little bit of the opposite. More men than women said they wanted economic change very much compared to political change. So which candidate is most likely, is more preferred or more likely to bring about significant political change to American politics? Who do they believe? Who do the American public believe this is going to bring about this change? So really half of respondents, 52%, right, believe that Donald Trump is more likely to bring about political change than any of the other candidates, obviously including Hillary Clinton. This is compared to 31% of respondents who said Hillary Clinton would bring about significant change. But take a look at the number for Donald Trump among Republicans, right? 82% of Republicans say that Donald Trump is the change agent that would be the person to really bring about the change that they want. While 56% of Democrats believe it's Hillary Clinton. So there's a lot of strong party differences here, right, in who Republicans and Democrats believe will bring about significant political change. Again, we divide this up across gender, and more men than women believe Donald Trump will bring about political change, while more women than men believe Hillary Clinton will bring about more political change, right? So again, not only partisan differences in opinions about change, but also gender differences in opinions about change. And again, with respect to economic change, we also asked it which candidate is more likely to bring about economic change. And when we look at economic change, again, we see that Donald Trump is viewed more likely to be the change agent than Hillary Clinton. Clearly among Republicans, for sure, although 67% of Democrats believe that Clinton can bring about significant economic change. And this is a higher number than the political change that they believe that she can bring about, right? So even among Democrats believe that she is more of a change agent when it comes to that economic system than when it comes to the political system. Again, similar gender disparities exist when we looked at political change. More men than women believe Trump is the economic change agent, and more women than men believe this about Hillary Clinton. Okay, so again, not only party differences, but gender differences in some of these disparities. So we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the numbers with respect to change to see if Americans felt that if a candidate was going to bring about change, what type of change would that be? Would that be change for the good? Would that be change for the bad or the negative? Okay, so we asked respondents, which of the following is closest to your view of the impact on our political system were Donald Trump to become president? Would he bring, he would not bring any fundamental change to the political system. He would bring profound change, but for the worse. Or he would bring profound change for the better. Or he would bring profound change, but it's unclear about what kind of change this would be, right? And here we can certainly see clear partisan differences in this response, right? In the type of change that people feel that Donald Trump will bring were he to become president. 3/4 of Democrats believe that Donald Trump would bring profound change to the political system, but that this change would be for the worse, right? That it's a change that certainly can occur, but it's not a change that Democrats welcome. And about half of Republican respondents believe that the profound change that Donald Trump would bring would be for the better. So we see, again, really clear partisan differences, and really, I think, a big issue that motivates people's choice for president among Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and this element of change that has played such a big role in this election. We also see, though, that it also seems that a number of Republicans, about a third, and about 4 in 10 independents don't know what kind of change is going to happen if Donald Trump becomes president. So there's a big swath of respondents or the electorate that are unsure about what's going to happen if he becomes president. So we asked the same thing about Hillary Clinton. What kind of change do you think she would bring if she were going to become president? And what we see here is that about a third of respondents and about a third of Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike say she won't bring any change, right? Again, sort of feeding into that narrative that Trump has put forward that she is part of the establishment, right? And there's not a whole lot of change that's going to take place if she becomes president. However, we do see that 60% of Republicans think she would bring a change for the worse, and that about 40% of Democrats say she would obviously bring a change for the better. So there are obviously variants among the partisans, but overall, Donald Trump is definitely seen much more as a change candidate than Hillary Clinton, and there's a lot of disagreement about what kind of change that would look like. We see about the same number of women believe she would bring a change for the better as well as change for the worse, but more men than women believe she represents no change at all or change for the worse possibly, so some differences across gender as well when it comes to this question. So also with respect to change, what kind of change are people looking for, right? So that's an important element of this as well. We talk about change being this overarching word that we're not sure what it encompasses. And so we also in this survey asked, whether people were generally comfortable with the political system as it is, whether people wanted change, but whether that change should be gradual, right, incremental change, or whether people were looking to blow up the system and wanted revolutionary change in the system. And we can see that overall Americans are split on the type of change that they're really looking for in the political system. We can agree that a majority want change, but what kind of change does this look like? And so this split also falls along party lines, right? 2/3 of Democrats prefer slow, gradual change to the political system, while over 2/3 of Republicans are looking to basically blow the system up, right? They want revolutionary change, and they really see Donald Trump as, sort of the one with the TNT in his hand to do that, right? So this really does help explain, I think, support for Hillary Clinton and support for Donald Trump when we start breaking down the type of change that people are looking for in this election. There are also, again, a few differences across gender with respect to the type of change. About half of male respondents prefer the revolutionary change, so more men want to blow the system up than women do. I'm not sure, I won't get into psychoanalyzing why that is for men, but women are more likely to prefer sort of this gradual change to the political system. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well. Another really important topic that I think has come out during this election is the idea of whether the system is rigged or not. We've heard that a lot, right? Donald Trump has been kind of beating that drum, particularly lately, that the system is rigged against the common American folks, and even taken it so far as saying, you know, the election system is rigged, and that we can't have faith or trust in our election system. So where does this fall in terms of how people feel about this idea of the system being rigged, okay? So we asked people, how much do you agree with the statement, our system is rigged against people like me? And really, Trump is hitting on something here, right? We see that the majority of respondents, 65%, agree that the system is rigged. So he really has his pulse on how I think people are thinking about the system being rigged, or at least this overall feeling that the system works against the common person, okay? One of the things that we've seen in this election is the support that Trump has had among the non-college educated. So I wanted to kind of take a look about the difference here in terms of feelings about the system being rigged when we look at people who have had some college education and those that haven't. And this rigged message has really resonated, I think, with Trump supporters who are largely non-educated whites. And when we look at the results of our poll, we see that Trump's largest support comes from those that are less educated who feel very strongly, 74%, right? Almost 3/4 of respondents who are non-college educated feel that the system is rigged against them. So he really is tapping into something and tapping into a particular constituency that feels very strongly about this. Now, that's not to say, of course, that those that are college educated don't have these similar sentiments. 6 in 10, not as high as a non-college educated, but certainly pretty high. And so that message is resonating across the board. So just to close out here, and we can discuss a little bit more about this in the Q&A with Bill, but we wanted to look at some other issues that have been important or prominent in this election, and we wanted to ask about people's sentiments about the Black Lives Matter movement. We examined what people's opinions were about the Black Lives Matter movement, and a little bit to my surprise, how completely sort of divisive this is along partisan lines. We see that 92% of Republicans see the Black Lives Matter movement as either strongly or somewhat unfavorable, okay? And this compares to Democrats. Almost 7 in 10 Democrats see the Black Lives Matter movement as strongly or somewhat favorable. And 60% of respondents overall, right, view this Black Lives Matter movement unfavorable. So it really is an issue, and I'm a little bit surprised by those results, quite frankly. I've seen other polls that show them a little bit more evenly split, and so that's a very interesting phenomenon when we start talking about sort of race relations in this country, and the movement has really gained prominence when we talk about race relations in the last several years, right? So when we do talk about this, how do people see race relations in this country? We've just come off of almost finishing the second term of our first African-American president, and I think it's an important question to ask, right? How Americans feel about race relations between blacks and whites in the U.S. And overall, this is obviously divided by partisanship as well, but overall, the majority of respondents, 66%, believe that race relations between blacks and whites currently is very or somewhat bad. So there's not a very positive opinion among the electorate about current race relations in America right now, and it's pretty evenly divided actually by partisanship, right? 64% of Republicans say the same thing, 69% of Democrats, and 62% of independents. So really quickly, who do we think as Americans would do a better job of dealing with race relations, right? As who's going to be the next president after Obama? What do people believe, the candidates, where do they stand in terms of their ability to be able to advance the interest of African Americans in this country? And so obviously it differs, again, by party. We see that overall 53% of respondents believe that Hillary Clinton would do a better job of improving race relations, while Republicans, 66% of Republicans believe the same. But overall, 63% of respondents believe that Donald Trump would not do a very good job of advancing race relations. All right, so I want to close off, and this is a little bit of difference between gender that I can talk a little bit more about the Q&A. But finally, an issue that has also been prominent in this election, and I want to thank Jared McDonald for really looking into this issue, that has made headlines, is the extent to which each candidate, either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, has been able to sort of bring partisans home. Right? So this is what happens toward the end of presidential elections. Partisans sort of come to their own camp and support the candidate regardless of whether that was their first choice for president or not. So bringing your partisans home is a big issue in this election. And so how much has each candidate been able to do this? In other words, how much has each candidate been able to solidify their base, right? We hear a lot about this in the news as well. And this figure really represents the vote intention for Clinton and Trump, separating the respondents by those who strongly identify with the party of their candidate from those who identify with the opposing party. And we can see that looking at opposing partisans, there's really no gap here at the bottom between those who support Clinton and those who support Trump, right? But we do see that both weak Democrats and strong Democrats support Clinton at a much higher rate than weak Republicans and strong Republicans support Trump. Looking at this, Clinton outperforms Trump almost 88% to 73% in sort of these weak or strong partisans, showing that there is a divide, right, between how well Hillary Clinton has been able to bring Democrats home versus how well Donald Trump has been able to bring Republicans home. And Jerry did a little analysis here, which really drives this point home, right? Because there's a 9-point deficit if we look at it overall about how well Hillary Clinton has been able to bring partisans home versus Donald Trump. But does this explain the gap between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in terms of overall support? And what we can see from this by sort of doing the simulation is what Jerry did was sort of equal out support for Clinton and Trump among strong and weak partisans, and we still see a gap. We still see a 4-point gap between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in terms of support. So bringing your party home does not fully explain the support for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. There are other issues that Trump needs to catch up on, right, in terms of wooing independents and perhaps weak Democrats to come over to his side in order for him to have a chance at winning the election. And I'll close it off there, and there's other issues that we can talk about during the Q&A. Great.
Well, thanks so much. That was great. It's an honor to have William Galston join us. I know that Dean Ball had mentioned, introduced him briefly, but I just want to say a few more things about him. Bill, who's been a great colleague of mine, initially at Maryland and then later at Brookings, is the Ezra Zilka Chair in the Brookings Institution Governance and Studies Program. And he's also a College Park professor at the University of Maryland. He also served as acting dean of the School of Public Policy here a dozen years ago. And he's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. He has written extensively. He's advised president. He was an advisor to President Clinton. He has written academically. He's written public policy. And to my mind, one of the most thoughtful, insightful analysts in Washington. And if you don't read his column in the Wall Street Journal, you should, because it's always got some very interesting take and a unique insight into the issues. So thank you so much for joining us, Bill. So what I'd like to do is give you an opportunity, first of all, to reflect on what you heard and saw and read. I know you've had the material in your possession beforehand. And then afterwards, we can have a follow-up discussion. So
Sure.
Welcome to Maryland.
Well, thanks so much. It's good to be back. Being a College Park professor is a little bit like the old Soviet economy, where I pretend to work and you pretend to pay me. This is a very rich survey, so rich that that the two presenters between them did not begin to exhaust it. And so I thought I'd take just a few minutes to put some other pieces of the survey on the table that I found particularly instructive. Let's begin with where you almost ended, this issue of rigging. Despite the fact that arguably Senator Elizabeth Warren launched this term into the contemporary political lexicon, in fact, Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to see a rigged system. The margin is really quite strikingly large, 24 percentage points. So it's no accident that you hear Donald Trump talking about the rigged economic and political system a lot more than former Secretary of State Clinton. It is much more of a theme among Republicans. So that's my first observation. The second has to do with attitudes towards the future, expectations about the future. And here the survey confirms what a lot of other previous surveys, including some that I've been involved in, have suggested, namely that Democrats are optimistic about the future, Republicans are pessimistic about the future. And so there was a question in your survey, how much opportunity for advancement do you believe the next generation will have compared to what you had? And by a margin of 15 points, Republicans are more likely to say less rather than more. And by a margin of 10 points, Democrats are more likely to say more rather than less. And when you rephrase the question as not the next generation, but people like you, the results are almost identical. The only thing I'd add to that, and this comes straight from a survey that was released at Brookings just last week, The Divide Over America's Future, 1950 or 2050, it turns out that a similar divide emerges when you look not forward, but backward. If you ask a very simple question, has American culture and its way of life changed for the worse or the better since the 1950s? 2/3 of Democrats say it's changed for the better. 2/3 of Republicans say it's changed for the worse. And so Republicans are looking to the past with nostalgia and to the future with fear. And with Democrats, it's just the opposite. And interestingly, although you might think that this is sort of an upscale, downscale distinction, it isn't, because African Americans and Latinos, including African Americans and Latinos who are not doing all that well, are hopeful about the future. So it's not just a snapshot in their minds. There is an internal narrative, the stories that people are telling themselves about their lives, which are optimistic regardless of contemporary social status for Democrats and pessimistic regardless of contemporary SES for Republicans. So it's the story that counts, not the snapshot. Let me just now take a couple of issues that have been particularly controversial in this campaign and put some quite interesting results from this survey on the table. Let's take immigration. One question in this survey: in order to ensure that good jobs go to American workers, the United States should do more to restrict the inflow of illegal immigrants across the border. This is sort of the foundation of the most famous piece of public architecture in contemporary American history, contemporary American politics, namely Mr. Trump's wall. And you have 87% of Republicans agreeing with that proposition compared to almost exactly half as many, 42% of Democrats. So that sounds like a stark difference of worldview. But what if you pull the camera back just a little bit and ask, well, just how important is this illegal immigration for our economic status anyway? There you find a substantial measure of agreement. So here's the very next question in your survey, which I thought was a very smart question. Ensuring that good jobs go to American workers has less to do with restricting the flow of illegal immigrants and more to do with our current economic and political systems and policies. Well, 83% of Democrats affirm that proposition, but so do 63% of Republicans. In other words, even in the midst of all of this fervor about illegal immigration, there is some sense of balance and perspective across the political spectrum, which is somewhat hopeful. And intriguingly, and this also mirrors other surveys, when the question is asked, well, should we offer a pathway to legal status for those living here illegally, almost half of Republicans say yes. This is not like the Black Lives Matter chart, not at all. And on the other side, when the survey asked, do you think English should be the official language of the United States, 93% of Republicans say yes, which sounds sort of exclusionary, but 77% of Democrats say the same thing. And I bet that figure, if you decomposed it, includes at least a plurality of Latinos. Betcha. So, one more comment about the electorate, and then I'll say something about people's priorities. There was also a trade question that I was put on the table, just for Mac's edification, but it seems to have disappeared. I'm coming around to the conclusion that in the contemporary United States, almost all politics is identity politics in one shape or form. And that raises the question, well, what do the denizens of the two political parties think of first? When questions are asked about, what's your strongest or most dominant identity? This is absolutely fascinating. When you ask Republicans that question, 53% say a citizen of the United States. Only 36% of Democrats say that. What about a citizen of the world? 3% of Republicans say that, but fully 21% of Democrats say that their primary identity is...
And if you look at millennials, it's much...
I'm sure that's true.
Yeah.
This is a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay? Conversely, when you ask the standard identity group questions, race, ethnicity, gender, SES, et cetera, you add all of those up, you get 12% of Republicans affirming any one of those as his or her primary identity. You add them all up on the Democratic side, it's 3 times as many, 36%. Identity politics, as conventionally defined, is much more pervasive on the Democratic side than it is on the Republican side, and make of that what you will. One more comment about domestic beliefs, and then I want to make one remark about foreign policy. I had stuff prepared about Syria, but it's now de trop. I took on board, Shibley, your very encouraging, numerical progression about attitudes towards the Muslim people and Islam. I cheered up considerably. And then I reached question 52. Which position is closer to yours? Islamic and Western and religious and social traditions are incompatible with each other, or most people in the West and in the Islamic world have similar needs and wants, so it should be possible to find common ground. Democrats, common ground is possible, 81. Traditions incompatible, 16. Republicans, traditions incompatible, 54. Common ground possible, 44. Those are huge gaps of perception, and it seems to me that amidst the optimism, there may be a decline in what might be technically and narrowly thought of as Islamophobia, but underneath that, you have the same sorts of cleavages in the United States that you see in Europe about the compatibility of Islam with the underlying traditions, the disagreements that have so far, I mean, I could tell you a wonderful story about this, but there's no time. But at any rate, that is the fundamental disagreement that has stalled the discussion of Turkey's accession to the EU, in my opinion. It's not fundamentally an economic or political question. The final preliminary observation I'd like to put on the table has to do with foreign policy priorities. If you look at domestic policy, the things that Republicans and Democrats think are the most important are almost completely disjoint. Right? You put those two tables of priorities side by side, there's very little overlap between them. In foreign policy, that is not true. And that's really interesting. Democrats and Republicans name the same top three priorities in the same order. Number one, fighting ISIS. Number two, immigration. Number three, trade. Okay, and all the classic foreign policy issues having to do with the resurgence of Russia, the rise of China, chaos in Yemen, the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, they barely move the needle. Yeah. What do these three issues have in common? Answer, each one affects the American people directly, right? They are really worried about terrorism, and immigration and trade are hot-button issues. These are the three issues where there is no, you could call them equally foreign policy issues and domestic policy issues. That is true for none of the other issues, and for those of us who take foreign policy controversies very seriously, what this illustrates is that presidents have substantial degrees of freedom on most foreign policy issues because the American people are not paying attention to these issues unless they blow up into a crisis. But let me conclude with one last note before we get to the conversation, and that has to do, with the situation in Syria that will confront the next president of the United States. And I'd put it this way. If Mr. Trump is elected president of the United States, he will face very strong pressure from his base to intervene militarily, even if he doesn't want to. If former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is the next president, she will face very strong resistance from her base against greater involvement in Syria, even if she wants to intensify it. So both of them are going to be faced with a tension between their foreign policy predilections and the most hot button of hot button issues overseas, and what their own bases are likely to permit them to do. With that, I will subside.
Well, as usual, that was great, thoughtful, added so much to the conversation. I just want to, your two comments, particularly one about identity, which is something, as you know, I study very much, and I think it's at the core of it. This is one reason why we haven't seen issues be, issues almost seem to be subsidiary to that bigger question, and it's fascinating to look at it in the context of American politics. But the priorities issue is really important about how people see these issues mattering to their lives. Because there's a debate going on about ISIS, which is this really a creation of our political discourse? Which is this really, should this be a priority for America? Certainly American political elites don't think so, even though the campaigns have adopted it. But you look at the discussion and say, well, it's not that big a threat to us if you compare it to other priorities. But I don't think it's just a function of political elite discourse. I think it is a function of the fact that people can connect it to something that matters to them, which is terrorism. And so it's very hard for people to overcome that. So they ride that tide. But the question I wanted to ask you was about this difference between Republicans and Democrats. You have noted particularly on attitudes toward the compatibility of Western values with Islamic values, this huge divide between Republicans and Democrats. We've seen that in prior, you served as a discussant for another poll on this, where I used to say the biggest divide in American politics over issues related to Islam and Muslims in the Middle East. It was 50 percentage points, a difference between Republicans and Democrats on attitudes bigger than on abortion, bigger than on gun control. But what we've seen just now on Black Lives Matter is even a bigger divide. It was like over 60 percentage points. So that's extraordinary. And this is only a specific question, not about general attitudes about race, obviously. But what are your thoughts on this? Did this lead to some thoughts about how the public is seen or how Republicans see it? Is this just a function of a polarized campaign right now, or is this a function of something different?
Well, in the survey that Brookings released, rather the team of the Public Religion Research Institute in Brookings released just last week, you see that a large majority of Republicans believe that the police treat white Americans and African Americans just the same. To put it mildly, that is not the dominant view among Democrats. And so if if your animating assumption is that there's no issue here, and then you see people standing up and yelling about it, you're not going to think very well of them. You're going to think that this is special pleading. It's not a response to a problem. It's an effort to make a point. And Republicans are also particularly exercised about the attack on the police that the Black Lives Matter movement appears to represent. So I don't find it. And then when you look at the ethnic composition of the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party, it almost explains itself. I mean, the Republicans are about an 85% white party. For Democrats, it's about 55%, and I think by the election of 2020, whites in the Democratic Party are probably going to be a minority. So you add those three things together, and I don't think it's hard to explain. And with regard to the first question, the more fervent a Christian you are, the more likely you are to see a cultural incompatibility between Islam and the West. Because if you're a fervent Christian, you tend to see Christianity as being the heart of the Western tradition. And by the way, scratch a secular European, and that's the attitude you'll find. So from that standpoint, the Democratic Party is much more of a secular party. Almost all Americans who are religiously unaffiliated have gone to the Democratic Party. So once again, it's not a tough analysis.
Well, to reinforce that, as you know, I did a poll through the Sadat chair a few months ago with an oversample of evangelicals. And so when you take the evangelicals out of the Republican Party, the attitudes of the rest of the Republican Party are not so different from the rest of the population on issues related to the Middle East and Islam and Muslims. So it clearly is that constituency that is defining where they are on that issue. Stella, any thoughts before I go to the floor?
No, I would also echo the fact that you were discussing this a little bit, and I know Robert Jones has done a lot of work on this. The sort of fall of evangelicalism, or the decline of evangelicalism in this country, and just the overall religion also helps explain, I think, a lot of what's going on in differences between the Republican and Democratic Party. And this idea, when you talk about identity politics and the differences there, the notion of Trump making America great again, that really is heartening to something that was occurring at, decades ago, that is either identity or that is either religion or a combination of both, that is a substitute for bringing that back despite the declining numbers that are occurring in the country currently. So I think all that plays into this identity narrative that you discussed so well with respect to what's going on overall in American politics today.
Great. We'll take questions. So the floor, first, Mac Dassler. Here's the microphone. So,
very interesting, wonderful. Bill Galston has said so many interesting things. I have to give a quick commercial that a week from tomorrow he'll be at the School of Public Policy the day after the election at noon to talk about what happened and why. So please join us there.
And depending on
raise
the outcome, I will either activate or deactivate my inquiry into Canadian real estate.
I have no idea which side you're on. I have a kind of a question about slight nuance modification. When you mentioned the wall, you mentioned the question being very clearly sharp differences between the parties. I'm wondering if, suppose one asked those questions 21 months ago, whether you would have gotten the same gap or whether they tend to be reinforced by the election. My case in point is our center and CISM have done quite a bit of polling on the Iran deal, some of it in working with Shibley. And interesting, when if you remember, last year was the big year for this. If you polled in the late spring, the Democrats were more positive about the prospect of deal, but there was quite a few Republicans who were supportive of the idea too. And the party difference was not so sharp. Then you asked, I think it was in August, after the deal was finally struck, and you looked at it by party. The party difference was much more sharper, partly I think because the way it had been publicized. Somebody who watched the issue would realize that it was already publicized politically with Netanyahu coming to the United States with the Republican senator's letter, but nevertheless this was not, I think, broadly known. So I wonder if on some of these issues, now certainly not on the black-white thing and not on maybe attitudes toward the future. These are probably enduring changes, but I wonder on some issues you don't have a temporary effect of issues that are highlighted in the election and therefore the Republicans or the Trump supporters flock to one position and the Democrats flock to the other one because for cognitive consistency or whatever.
any thoughts?
I do have a thought on that question, Mac, and that is that a standard move of a successful politician is to intuit something about the electorate that is not obvious to other people, including frequently to the electorate itself, to mirror it back to them, and a substantial portion of the electorate experiences a shock of recognition. For the Hegelians in the room, it's the movement from the in itself to the for itself. I see we have a philosopher in the audience. I thought I'd wake him up. And so, on the one hand, you have an intensification of a sentiment, and on the other hand, this process begins by drawing upon an existing sentiment. There is very little persuasion left in American politics. A lot of it has to do with making what's implicit or inchoate explicit and organized. My second comment is this. The big political story of the past 50 years, in my opinion, is the long march of the white working class from the base of the Democratic Party to the base of the Republican Party. And if you look at the narrative of the white working class over those 50 years, look at it objectively, I think the changes that have occurred in those two generations will go a very long distance towards explaining the differences of attitudes towards trade and immigration, et cetera. So I don't think the primary independent variable is the campaign itself. I think the problem is the problem. It's not the speech about the problem. It's the problem. Now, I'm not saying that there haven't been some shifts, but there are good reasons to believe that a campaign that has really focused on one segment of the population is, is underscoring attitudes that they already had, as opposed to creating those attitudes, or so I believe.
Anything to add?
No, I completely agree with Bill. I think with respect, you're talking about projecting something that's already there, and the wall is the perfect example of that. The wall is a way for people, the way that Trump talks about the wall did not develop attitudes about immigration. Those attitudes about immigration were already there. This is a way to conceptualize how to deal with immigration, right? Regardless of whether it's actually even possible. Right? We don't hear a whole lot about how the wall is really going to be paid for, whether Trump can get Mexico to pay for it, whether it's even going to be built. That really is beside the point when we talk about attitudes about immigration. It is just really a way to conceptualize those attitudes in a way that other candidates weren't able to do. He started his campaign with that, and it really captured people in a way that really projected their attitudes, I think, a number of his supporters, about immigration in ways that they had not thought of that before, but it didn't develop those attitudes. So I completely agree with Bill on those sentiments about attitudes already being established.
That reminds me of my favorite New Yorker cartoon of the past 12 months. It's heaven. A couple of angels are floating around, and they're sort of leaning on a big wall. And one says to the other, "The best thing is we got hell to pay for it."
Perfect. Perfect.
Can't make this stuff up. No. Who's next?
Gary Mitchell.
Thanks very much, as always. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write something called the Mitchell Report. And the only sort of big surprise for me out of this poll was when you asked people to name their most favored leaders or their least favored leaders. Nobody seemed to mention the former president of Mexico. I don't know how that happened. Apparently, Gary Johnson wasn't in the poll. This is a kind of, it's like a sight gag in comedy, but as I'm sitting here listening to this, I'm imagining listening to the characterization that comes out of the data, and I'm imagining 2 rooms full of these people. In one room, we have a group of people who are, A, looking to the past, and B, thinking in revolutionary terms about the future. We call them Republicans in this case. In the other room, we have people who are looking ahead and thinking incrementally about how to get there. Mm-hmm. And my questions that come from that are, what do we learn from, if it is fair to do that construct, what do we learn what do we learn about this that might shed some light on 2 questions? One is predictions about turnout, and second, hypotheses about what the first 100 days of any administration might look like.
Well, by the way, we do have some ideas on turnout, because we did ask a question, we didn't put it out there, about motivation. How motivated are you to vote in this election? And we find that Trump supporters are more highly motivated than Clinton supporters. These other polls have shown this. It's not unique. So that's a big question. It's definitely a big question, and in fact, I just placed an article based on the Syria data because the question related to whether some people on the left in the Democratic Party are comfortable enough with Hillary Clinton, given the way she has been framed, and that's going to be a question. Obviously, I don't know what the answer to it is. We'll see soon, but I think, and I hope that what we're seeing. Just in terms of what was reported over the past few days, I don't know if you've followed the the early voting. The early voting is slightly ahead of lost election, but what's below in the early voting is the millennial early voting is below the level that it was, and that's obviously a constituency that had tended to be more Democratic. So it's I don't know whether to make much of this because there are too many variables that are involved here, but it's something to watch. Any thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things on the early voting as well. I've been looking pretty carefully at minority voters. And we talk about Trump supporters being very much more enthusiastic or motivated to vote. Well, guess what? Minority voters are motivated. And Trump is, at least anecdotally, a large motivating factor for minority voters. We've seen in early voting states, and states like Florida, where early voting among Latinos is up, early voting among Asian Americans is up. And so how these groups sort of are motivated to come out to vote in response to the rhetoric of Donald Trump, and perhaps not so much for Hillary Clinton, I think will be a large story in this election.
There's another side to that story. In 2012, for the first time in American history, African-American turnout exceeded white turnout by 2 percentage points. I never viewed it as likely that that would recur in 2016, and there's early evidence of declining motivation among African-American voters, and depending on which state you're talking about, that can be a really big deal. But we have to put this in perspective, because if you want a sort of a rough and ready arithmetic formula, turnout is the weighted sum of motivation and organization. Trump has a lot of motivation on his side, but no organization. Hillary Clinton has less motivation, but a lot more organization. And so we shall see what the weighted sum of those two variables turns out to be. I mean, there is a fair amount of political science to the effect that a really large difference in the ground game, famous phrase, can be worth at least as much as a point or even a point and a half. That doesn't sound like a lot, but right now I'm sure Hillary Clinton thinks that that's a lot, because if she's tied in the polls on election day, she is likely to win by a couple of points. In the same way, if you go back and take a look at the polling right before the 2012 election, it was essentially a tie, but Obama ended up winning by 4 points. And I think a substantial portion of the difference between the final few days of polling on the one hand and the actual results had to do with the superior organization, data, et cetera, that was backing up the Democratic ground game. But you posed a second question as well, which is graver, and that has to do with the first 100 days. The first 100 days can either blow up the next administration or get it off on the right foot. The next president of the United States will not have the luxury that Barack Obama enjoyed during his first 2 years, namely, a stable majority in the House and a supermajority in the Senate. That will not happen, right? There is no bell curve that produces more than a fraction of a 1% prediction, for the next president to enjoy 60 Senate seats, and a stable House majority. I think that Paul Ryan may find out soon what it's like to be the head of a very unstable House majority. And so there are 2 options for the next president: bipartisanship or gridlock. There is no third option. And the next president can materially affect the odds of one or the other outcome based on not only the agenda that he or she puts first, but also the tone and demeanor within which that agenda is advanced. Stay tuned.
Well, thank you so very much.
I think
we have one.
Chris, did you have your hand up?
Yeah. Well, no. We'll take a last question.
Yeah.
So.
I'll make it short. One of the oddities about this election is that it's not clear the sense in which Mr. Trump
If I may add to that too, I mean, that's also true, by the way, about Bernie Sanders, who was an independent who almost captured the Democratic Party. So that's a sentiment that was across the board. But what I've noted with Trump is that while people embraced him and he took on party orthodoxy on so many issues, including the Iraq War, which was like a big issue, for Republicans, where he goes against the Iraq War and says it's part of the problem. But it doesn't look like he moved his constituency with him. So they embraced him, but they didn't necessarily embrace his positions, at least on some of the issues that I've looked at. And I wonder whether you both have thoughts about that.
I do, but if you'd like to go first.
Well, I mean, I think this is a very unusual election, right? And I mean, that's an understatement. There's so much overlay in people being fed up that I think, this idea of whether the Republican nominee actually represents Republican issues or even sticks with his own sort of stance on particular issues doesn't really matter, right? I mean, there is this element, I think the term about sort of being baked in, it's baked in. It does not really matter at whatever point when there's a tape showing him taking the opposite position of the one he took yesterday, right? It just doesn't matter. And it really, I think a lot of it is explained by the fact that people want something different. And whether he can bring about that change, whether it's all smoke and mirrors, at this point, it doesn't matter. And there's a lot that explains relative to issue positions that would be important in previous presidential elections or in normal presidential elections. And I think that's a large part of the narrative.
The modern Republican Party has been defined by Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's legacy. In my opinion, this is the year in which Reagan has moved from living history to history. And I say that because Donald Trump is Ronald Reagan with a minus sign. Trump does not believe in limited government. He believes in unlimited government as long as he's in charge of it. He is not a very plausible, cultural conservative, put it mildly, and he's not an internationalist in foreign policy. He has more or less promised he's called into question every single international institution and alliance that the United States has helped to build and lead over the past 70 years. Now, under those circumstances, and this is my punchline, you might expect a serious split in the Republican Party in the same way that you had a serious split in the Republican Party in 1964 and a serious split in the Democratic Party in 1972. Guess what? The Republican Party, as of the most recent surveys, is now as totally united around Trump as the Democrats are around Clinton and as united around Trump as Republicans usually are. What this tells me is that political polarization, defined as Team A, Team B, is the dominant political phenomenon of our times. We have put that hypothesis to the ultimate test in 2016, and the results are in.
With that depressing note, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
It was great.
Thank you.
Real pleasure.